The shocking cold case of 1946 remains one of the most disturbing chapters in criminal history. A family's darkest secrets lay buried for decades, revealing a pattern of abuse so horrific that investigators still struggle to comprehend its full scope. What happened behind those closed doors defies everything we understand about family bonds and human decency. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The spring of 1903 brought an unusual stir to the quiet valleys of Appalachia. Thomas Blackwood arrived with his family in tow, a solemn-faced wife, Martha, and 7 daughters of varying ages, all dressed in identical dark clothing. The locals remember how they appeared overnight, like shadows stretching across the mountain landscape, bringing with them trunks of possessions and an air of mystery that clung to them like morning mist. They had money, that was clear enough, recalls Elmer Johnson, whose grandfather owned the general store at the time. Thomas Blackwood paid cash for everything, 300 acres of prime woodland that nobody thought would ever sell. Never asked for credit, never explained where the money came from. Within weeks, the Blackwood estate took shape on the hillside. No outside laborers were hired. The family worked in eerie silence from dawn till dusk. The house grew like something organic from the forest floor. A sprawling 2-story structure with oddly placed windows and a wraparound porch that seemed to embrace the building like protective arms. Thick woods surrounded the property, creating a natural barrier between the Blackwoods and curious eyes. Martha Blackwood was rarely seen in town after their arrival. When she did appear, she spoke in whispers, her eyes constantly darting to her husband for permission before answering even the simplest questions. The daughters, pale and quiet, stood in formation behind their parents, never speaking unless spoken to directly. My grandmother tried to welcome them with a basket of preserves, says Ruth Miller, a lifelong resident. Thomas thanked her politely enough, but made it clear they preferred to keep to themselves, said they had special ways that outsiders wouldn't understand. Inside the imposing walls of their new home, the patriarch established his kingdom. The rules were absolute and unquestionable. Thomas preached a doctrine he called purity of blood, a twisted ideology that became the foundation of family life. The children were forbidden from interacting with townspeople, and Martha enforced her husband's edicts with trembling hands and downcast eyes. As months passed, the community's initial curiosity curdled into suspicion. Strange sounds sometimes echoed from the property at night, chanting perhaps, or crying. Livestock went missing from nearby farms. Children reported seeing faces at the upper windows of the Blackwood house, pale and watchful. Eventually, the townspeople settled into a pattern of willful ignorance. The Blackwoods made it abundantly clear that questions were unwelcome, and most locals decided that whatever happened behind those walls was none of their business. The family became a subject of whispered conversations and cautionary tales told to misbehaving children. "Stay away from Blackwoodland" became a common warning. They don't want company, and neither should you. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Dr. James Miller's hands trembled slightly as he packed his medical bag. The birth had been successful, but something about the Blackwood household left him deeply unsettled. He had been summoned in the dead of night, practically dragged up the winding path to the imposing estate by Thomas Blackwood himself, a man whose reputation for reclusiveness was matched only by whispers of his unexplained wealth. The doctor had delivered hundreds of babies throughout Appalachia, but never had he witnessed such strange family dynamics. The mother, barely 18, had shown no emotion during the entire ordeal. No joy, no relief, not even pain. More disturbing was how Thomas hovered over the proceedings, his eyes never leaving the newborn, muttering about purity of blood and the continuation of our sacred line. When Dr. Miller attempted to ask about the young mother's care or suggest a follow-up visit, Thomas Blackwood's demeanor changed instantly. "Your services are no longer required," he had stated coldly, pressing an envelope containing far too much money into the doctor's palm. "What happens within these walls remains within these walls. Do not return uninvited." As word of the birth spread through town, Dr. Miller cautiously shared his concerns with Sheriff William Tanner over coffee at the local establishment. "Something isn't right in that house, William. The way they interact, the silence of the women, the controlling behavior." The sheriff merely shrugged. "The Blackwoods keep to themselves, James. Been that way since they arrived 5 years ago. Not our place to question how folks raise their families, especially those with connections." This reluctance to interfere typified the community's response. When Eliza Jenkins, the general store owner, mentioned that the Blackwood daughters only shopped in pairs and never spoke unless spoken to, the townspeople nodded, but quickly changed the subject. When Reverend Thomas noted their absence from Sunday services despite their professed religious devotion, the congregation murmured about different ways of worship. The prevailing attitude of the time, that family matters were private affairs, combined with the region's deep-rooted religious fundamentalism to create a perfect shield for the Blackwoods. Neighbors rationalized the family's oddities as simply outsider ways, preferring comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable questions. In the months following the birth, the Blackwood estate became even more isolated. The gates remained locked, deliveries were left at the property line, and sightings of family members grew increasingly rare. The high stone walls seemed to grow taller, the surrounding forest thicker, as if nature itself conspired to hide whatever secrets lay within. Behind those walls, Martha Blackwood watched her husband's control tighten around their daughters. Knowing that the grandchild's birth marked not a joyous new chapter, but a darker turn in their family's twisted story. The autumn of 1910 brought unseasonable rain to the Appalachian valleys, forcing Elijah Tanner to abandon his usual hunting routes. Venturing deeper into the wooded hills than ever before, the experienced hunter found himself at the edge of Blackwood property. As dusk approached, he noticed something peculiar through the thinning foliage, a small clearing where the earth had been disturbed in several places. Curiosity overcame caution as Elijah approached what was unmistakably a hidden cemetery. 7 small mounds of earth, some appearing freshly turned, formed an uneven circle around a larger central grave. Each was marked not with proper headstones, but with crude wooden markers, bearing symbols he'd never encountered. Spiraling patterns that seemed to twist inward upon themselves. Strange angular carvings that resembled no alphabet he recognized. "Something ain't right about this," he muttered, backing away when he noticed small handprints pressed into one of the wooden markers. The hunter made his way back to town by nightfall, his discovery weighing heavily on his mind. The following morning, Elijah reported what he'd found to Sheriff James Holloway. The lawman's reaction was immediate. His face drained of color, and he dismissed the hunter with unexpected harshness. "You were trespassing on private property," the sheriff said, refusing to make eye contact. "The Blackwoods handle their affairs in their own way. Best you forget what you saw." Word spread quickly despite the sheriff's attempts to silence Elijah. In hushed conversations at the general store and whispered exchanges outside Sunday service, the cemetery became the town's darkest secret. Mothers warned children to stay clear of Blackwood land, embellishing tales of ghosts and curses to keep them safe from what they feared might be something far worse. When pressed by a concerned minister about investigating the property, Sheriff Holloway revealed what many had long suspected. "My grandmother was a Blackwood before she married," he admitted reluctantly. Family matters stay within the family. The cemetery became a forbidden place in local lore, mentioned only in whispers as the years passed. Children dared each other to venture near the Blackwood property line, but none were brave enough to seek out the gravesite itself. Meanwhile, Thomas Blackwood reinforced the boundaries of his estate, hiring men from 2 counties away to construct a higher fence with clear warnings against trespassers. The family retreated further into isolation, appearing in town even less frequently than before. Their secrecy deepened like the roots of the ancient trees that surrounded their property, twisted, hidden, and drawing strength from the darkness. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Elizabeth Blackwood stood at the window of the family's sprawling Appalachian estate, her delicate fingers tracing patterns on the dusty glass. Unlike her siblings, who had long ago surrendered to their father's will, Elizabeth harbored a quiet defiance behind her gentle demeanor. At just 15, she had developed an acute awareness of the darkness that permeated their isolated world. From her vantage point, she could see her sisters moving through the property like ghosts, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of Thomas Blackwood's doctrine. The patriarch had twisted religious teachings into something unrecognizable, a perversion that demanded absolute obedience and isolation. His 7 older daughters bore the heaviest burden, forced into roles that Elizabeth could scarcely comprehend, but instinctively feared. The outside world brings only corruption, Thomas would proclaim during their mandatory evening gatherings. Our suffering purifies us. This is our divine mission. His voice would boom through the cavernous main hall, eyes burning with conviction that bordered on madness. Elizabeth's heart ached for her siblings. At night, she would sometimes hear her sisters weeping in their shared bedroom, their sobs muffled against thin pillows. She longed to comfort them, but feared drawing her father's attention. The youngest daughter had learned early that invisibility offered a measure of protection within these walls. The children received no formal education beyond Thomas's selective biblical teachings. Maps were forbidden, newspapers banned, and questions about the world beyond their property met with swift punishment. Martha, their mother, had long ago retreated into a shell of compliance, her once vibrant spirit extinguished by years under her husband's control. "Remember, daughter," Martha had whispered to Elizabeth one rare moment they were alone. "There is goodness beyond these walls." It was the closest thing to rebellion Elizabeth had ever witnessed from her mother, and she treasured the words like precious gems. Elizabeth developed subtle ways to resist. She memorized the layout of the surrounding forest during supervised walks. She listened intently when rare visitors came to the property, storing away fragments of information about towns, roads, and people. She observed the patterns of her father's moods, learning when to be invisible and when a carefully timed question might yield a scrap of useful knowledge. At night, Elizabeth would lie awake, imagining escape routes and fantasizing about a life where fear didn't permeate every moment. Yet her dreams always circled back to her siblings. How could she leave them behind? This internal conflict tormented her, the desperate yearning for freedom warring with her fierce loyalty to her brothers and sisters. What Thomas Blackwood never realized was that his youngest daughter's apparent compliance masked a resilience that grew stronger with each passing day. Behind Elizabeth's sweet smile and downcast eyes, a plan was slowly forming, one that would eventually shake the foundations of the Blackwood legacy. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The spring of 1911 brought an unexpected visitor to the isolated Blackwood estate. George Hartford, a traveling Bible salesman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, had been working his way through the Appalachian communities when he found himself at the edge of the property. Most locals avoided the area entirely, but George was new to the region and unaware of the whispered warnings about the family that lived behind those towering gates. Elizabeth Blackwood was tending to the garden near the perimeter when she first spotted him. At 19, she had never spoken to a man outside her family. The young woman froze, her hands still buried in the soil as George approached with a friendly wave. Their conversation lasted barely 2 minutes before her brother appeared, his stern presence enough to send the salesman on his way. But in those brief moments, George had seen something in her eyes, a desperate loneliness that haunted him for days afterward. Against his better judgment, the salesman returned a week later. This time, Elizabeth was alone, and their conversation, though hushed and hurried, planted a dangerous seed of hope in her heart. The outsider spoke of towns and cities, of women who chose their own paths, of a world beyond the suffocating walls of her father's domain. "I'll be back through these parts every month," he whispered as he prepared to leave. "If you ever need anything." 3 days later, Elizabeth took the most daring risk of her life. While collecting firewood in the forest that bordered their property, she placed a carefully folded letter beneath a distinctive stone marked with a small cross. The letter, written on paper torn from her father's ledger, contained no names or explicit details. Thomas Blackwood had taught his children that outsiders were constantly looking for ways to destroy their sacred family. When George discovered the hidden message on his next visit, their secret correspondence began. Elizabeth's letters revealed glimpses of her reality. The 7 sisters bound by their father's twisted doctrine, the babies that appeared and sometimes disappeared, the punishments for disobedience. She wrote in coded language, referring to her father as the shepherd and her sisters as the flock, but the horror beneath her words was unmistakable. For Elizabeth, these letters became a lifeline. Each response from George confirmed that another world existed beyond the trees that encircled their property. The salesman began leaving small tokens alongside his letters, a ribbon, a hard candy, once even a tiny book of poetry. Each treasure she hid beneath the floorboards of her room, tangible proof that someone outside cared about her fate. "I dream of freedom," she wrote in one letter, "but I cannot leave them behind. We are bound together in ways you cannot understand. Help us, please." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. George Hartford found himself at the center of a web of secrets far darker than he'd imagined. The small stone where he'd first discovered Elizabeth Blackwood's letter now concealed messages from multiple hands. Different handwriting, different voices, but united by the same desperate hope. He realized with growing horror that he wasn't corresponding with just one trapped young woman, but with several of the Blackwood sisters. "Please help us," read one note, the handwriting shaky and uncertain. Another contained just 3 words: "Father watches everything." The letters never explicitly detailed what occurred behind the walls of the Blackwood estate, but the implications chilled George to his core. The Bible salesman, once merely curious about the isolated family, now felt a moral obligation to act. The correspondence became a vital connection to the outside world for the Blackwood daughters. Through carefully coded messages, they shared small victories and warned each other of their father's increasingly volatile moods. Elizabeth emerged as their quiet leader, orchestrating this dangerous dance of resistance and hope. George approached the local sheriff with his concerns, clutching one of the more alarming letters as evidence. "These girls need help," he insisted, his voice trembling with urgency. The lawman merely chuckled, sliding the paper back across his desk. "Mister, we don't meddle in family business around here," the sheriff drawled. "Thomas Blackwood keeps to himself, pays his taxes, and attends church. Whatever stories those girls are spinning, well, young ladies have vivid imaginations." Behind the imposing walls of the estate, Thomas tightened his grip on the family. He installed new locks on bedroom doors and nailed shut windows that might offer glimpses of the outside world. The patriarch instituted mandatory prayer sessions 3 times daily, during which he would inspect each family member for signs of disobedience. "Purity requires vigilance," Thomas would declare, his eyes scanning the faces of his daughters for any flicker of defiance. "The outside world brings only corruption and sin. Despite the escalating control, Elizabeth's quiet rebellion spread among her siblings like a whispered prayer. The younger children, witnessing her subtle acts of courage, began questioning their father's doctrine in the privacy of their thoughts. When Thomas demanded absolute submission, they would outwardly comply while nurturing the seeds of doubt Elizabeth had planted. One evening, after discovering a forbidden book beneath a mattress, Thomas Blackwood unleashed his fury on the entire household. The punishment was severe, but that night, 3 more letters appeared beneath the marked stone in the forest, proof that his daughter's spirits remained unbroken. George Hartford read these messages with tears in his eyes, knowing that despite his failures with local authorities, he had become these women's only hope. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. George Hartford soon discovered that his correspondence wasn't limited to Elizabeth alone. Other Blackwood sisters had begun leaving their own messages beneath the marked stone in the forest. Each letter revealed fragments of their shared nightmare, creating a mosaic of suffering that left the Bible salesman increasingly disturbed. "Please help us," read one note, written in shaky handwriting. "Father watches everything. We cannot speak freely, even among ourselves." The letters became a vital connection to the outside world for the sisters, who used them to coordinate small acts of resistance against Thomas Blackwood's tyranny. They would create distractions to allow one another brief moments of respite or warn each other about their father's volatile moods. George tried desperately to involve the local sheriff, presenting the letters as evidence of wrongdoing at the Blackwood estate. His concerns were swiftly dismissed. "Those Blackwoods keep to themselves, and that's their right," the sheriff told infernally. "We don't meddle in family matters around here, especially not on the word of some traveling salesman." Meanwhile, Thomas tightened his grip on the family. New rules emerged daily, restrictions on movement, speech, even eye contact. The punishments for disobedience grew increasingly severe. Elizabeth watched her siblings suffer, her determination to escape strengthening with each passing day. One night in early spring, the community awoke to an unexpected discovery. A newborn infant, wrapped carefully in a handmade blanket, had been left on the church steps with a note pinned to its swaddling. "This child deserves freedom. Please protect what is innocent." The baby's appearance caused a sensation throughout the area. Whispers connected the child to the mysterious Blackwood family, but without proof, the rumors remained just that, rumors. A local couple, unable to have children of their own, took in the infant with the blessing of the church pastor. Elizabeth, maintaining a facade of unwavering loyalty to her father, gradually earned limited privileges around the house. During one of Thomas's rare absences, she managed to access his private study and discovered a locked drawer in his desk. Using a hairpin, she carefully worked the simple lock until it yielded. Inside lay several documents, including a hand-drawn map with peculiar markings that seemed to indicate locations across several states. Elizabeth realized with growing excitement that this could be their key to freedom, a path away from her father's control. She quickly memorized what she could before returning everything exactly as she had found it. That night, as she lay awake planning, Elizabeth felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Acting too hastily might doom them all to worse punishment. Yet waiting too long meant more suffering for her sisters and the innocent children born into this nightmare. "I need more time," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "Just a little more time to get everyone out safely." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Word of the Blackwoods' disturbing practices finally breached the walls of secrecy surrounding the family. By early 1915, whispers of abuse had reached the ears of state authorities in Tennessee. A county official, after receiving multiple anonymous reports, reluctantly initiated paperwork for a formal investigation into the isolated estate. Thomas Blackwood, ever vigilant about threats to his domain, learned of the impending investigation through his connections in local government. The patriarch wasted no time. Within 48 hours of receiving this information, he mobilized the entire family with military precision. Under cover of darkness, they abandoned the Appalachian property that had been their fortress for over a decade. When investigators arrived 3 days later, they found only an empty house. Drawers hung open, personal items were scattered, and cold ashes filled the fireplace. Evidence of documents hastily burned. The authorities searched the property thoroughly, but found no trace of the family's whereabouts. One investigator noted in his report that it felt as though the earth had simply swallowed them whole. Elizabeth Blackwood, who had nurtured fragile hopes of rescue, felt those dreams crumble as their wagon traveled through the night toward Kentucky. The young woman watched silently as familiar landmarks disappeared behind them, taking with them any chance that George Hartford might find her again. The Bible salesman, who had become her only connection to the outside world, would return to find nothing but an abandoned home. In Kentucky, Thomas established a new compound, more isolated than before. The family settled into a remote farmhouse surrounded by dense woodland, miles from the nearest neighbor. Here, the patriarch implemented even stricter controls. The sisters were forbidden from venturing beyond the porch without supervision, and Thomas installed locks on every door and window. Despite these measures, Elizabeth and her sisters maintained their secret network of communication. They developed a new system of coded messages hidden in mundane tasks, patterns in hanging laundry, arrangements of kitchen items, or markings on water buckets. These subtle signals became their lifeline, allowing them to warn each other of their father's moods and coordinate small acts of resistance. Martha Blackwood, increasingly frail from years of abuse, watched her daughters with a mixture of fear and silent pride. Though unable to protect them openly, she occasionally created distractions that allowed the sisters precious moments of unmonitored conversation. The official investigation back in Tennessee gradually lost momentum. Records were misplaced, witnesses suddenly became reluctant to speak, and eventually the case was quietly closed. The Blackwood file was buried in administrative archives, where it would remain untouched for decades, until the discovery of a yellowed map in 1946 would bring their secrets back into the light. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The yellowed map, retrieved from the safety deposit box in April of 1946, sent ripples through the Tennessee law enforcement community. What had begun as a routine inventory at the small-town bank had unearthed the first tangible evidence of a family that had faded into local legend. Sheriff James Miller assembled a special task force, determined that this time the Blackwood case wouldn't disappear into bureaucratic shadows. "This isn't just some treasure map," the sheriff told his deputies as they studied the hand-drawn document. "These markings correspond to properties across 3 states. The team meticulously traced property records, tax filings, and local rumors, eventually identifying Blackwood-connected estates in Kentucky, North Carolina, and back in Tennessee, all strategically isolated and eerily similar in layout. The original Blackwood estate in Appalachia became the investigation's focal point. 31 years of abandonment had transformed the once imposing property into a decaying monument to secrets. Thick vines strangled the exterior walls, while forest undergrowth reclaimed the carefully maintained grounds that had once kept curious neighbors at bay. Forensic teams worked methodically through the property, photographing and cataloging every disturbing detail. In the main house, they discovered hidden rooms behind false walls, accessible only through cleverly disguised mechanisms. One investigator found a loose floorboard in what appeared to be Elizabeth's former bedroom, revealing a small cavity containing a child's doll with peculiar markings etched into its wooden face. The most significant discoveries came from the basement. Behind a heavy storage cabinet, technicians uncovered a sealed room containing stacks of moldering papers. Though many had deteriorated beyond recognition, several documents remained legible enough to reveal a system of coded communication. Experts brought in from Washington confirmed these were records of births, lineages, and what appeared to be a twisted doctrine of blood purity written in Thomas Blackwood's distinctive handwriting. "The level of organization is chilling," noted Dr. Eleanor Simmons, the forensic psychologist assigned to the case. This wasn't just a family with unusual practices. This was a carefully constructed system designed for control and isolation. Outside the main house, investigators located the cemetery the hunter had stumbled upon decades earlier. Now overgrown with weeds and saplings, the unmarked graves yielded their own grim evidence. Exhumation revealed the remains of at least 14 individuals, many showing signs of malnutrition and untreated illness. As the evidence mounted, what had once been dismissed as backwoods rumor crystallized into horrifying reality. The Blackwood family had not simply disappeared. They had evolved, spreading their doctrine across state lines while maintaining their veil of secrecy. The map that had triggered this investigation was proving to be more than just a geographical guide. It was the first thread in unraveling a tapestry of generational abuse that had continued unchecked for nearly half a century. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The documentary jumps forward to 1946, when the discovery of the yellowed map in the safety deposit box sends shockwaves through the quiet Tennessee town. Federal authorities, initially skeptical, begin piecing together the Blackwoods' movements across decades, identifying 3 properties spanning different states where descendants continue to live in isolation, hidden from public scrutiny. Agent Richard Miller, assigned to the case, assembles a team of investigators who meticulously examine property records, birth certificates, and local rumors. The pattern was unmistakable once we knew what to look for, Miller would later recall in his memoirs. It was like following a ghost, always just out of reach, but leaving traces everywhere. Forensic teams descend upon the original Blackwood estate, now an overgrown testament to abandoned secrets. The property, reclaimed by nature and shrouded in local superstition, yields disturbing evidence. Investigators discover hidden rooms behind false walls, secret compartments beneath floorboards, and remnants of coded documents partially destroyed by time and elements. The basement, accessed through a concealed trapdoor, contains what appears to be a makeshift medical facility with rusted instruments that send chills through even the most hardened investigators. Local residents, once reluctant to speak about the family, begin sharing stories passed down through generations. "My grandmother used to cross the street when she saw Thomas Blackwood in town," explains one elderly witness. "She said his eyes were empty, like looking into a well with no bottom." The team recovers fragments of journals, scraps of correspondence, and faded photographs showing solemn-faced women and children with striking familial resemblances. DNA testing, though primitive by modern standards, confirms what many had suspected. The genetic markers indicate a disturbing pattern of inbreeding spanning multiple generations. Martha Blackwood's distant relatives, tracked down in neighboring counties, provide crucial information about family traditions and beliefs. One cousin, speaking on condition of anonymity, reveals they believed outsiders were impure. Thomas preached that only blood of their blood could continue what he called the sacred lineage. As evidence mounts, the legend of the Blackwood family transitions from whispered rumor to documented horror. Maps of the property are cross-referenced with the cryptic markings on the discovered map, leading investigators to several unmarked graves not previously found by local authorities. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, revealing a network of complicity that protected the family's secrets for nearly half a century. The investigation, gaining momentum with each passing day, begins to uncover connections to other isolated communities and missing persons cases spanning the eastern United States. What started as a curious discovery in a forgotten safety deposit box now threatens to expose one of the most disturbing family legacies in American history. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The breakthrough in the Blackwood case came in 1987 when Dr. Margaret Winters, a social worker specializing in child psychology, noticed disturbing patterns among 3 siblings she had helped place with adoptive families in eastern Tennessee. The children, though unrelated according to official records, shared unusual physical traits, a distinctive ear formation, and rare genetic markers that appeared during routine medical screenings. "I couldn't ignore the similarities," Dr. Winters explained in her testimony. "When I saw those test results, I knew something wasn't right. These children came from different counties, different years, but their DNA told another story." What began as professional curiosity soon consumed her life. Margaret spent weekends driving through Appalachian backroads, knocking on doors of elderly residents who might remember the Blackwood family. Many doors closed in her face, but those who spoke painted fragments of a larger horror. The old folks would lower their voices, she recalled. They'd look over their shoulders before telling me about those people up on the ridge, or that family nobody talked about. One elderly woman showed me a photograph of her church group from 1923. In the background, barely visible, was a young woman who matched Elizabeth Blackwood's description, watching from the tree line. The social worker meticulously documented each conversation, building a geographical and genealogical map that stretched across 3 states. Her breakthrough came when she located a retired midwife who had delivered babies in isolated communities throughout the 1960s. The midwife described attending births where the mother seemed unusually young and fearful, all living in compounds with similar rules and structures to the original Blackwood estate. Margaret's unofficial investigation eventually reached FBI Special Agent Robert Calloway, who had been reviewing cold cases with ritualistic elements. The combination of her detailed research and newly available DNA technology provided enough evidence to reopen the investigation officially. What Dr. Winters uncovered wasn't just one family's tragedy, Calloway stated. It was a sprawling network that had operated in plain sight for generations. As news of the investigation spread, more evidence emerged from unlikely sources. A librarian in Kentucky discovered newspaper clippings from 1932 describing a reclusive family whose patriarch bore striking resemblance to Thomas Blackwood. A history professor produced photographs from a regional archive showing the construction of a compound matching descriptions of the second Blackwood property. These fragments, meaningless in isolation, formed a damning picture when assembled. DNA testing confirmed what Margaret had suspected. Dozens of seemingly unrelated individuals across the Appalachian region shared genetic markers with the original Blackwood line, revealing a hidden dynasty built on decades of abuse and isolation. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The confession came on a rainy Tuesday in April. James Wilkins, a retired sheriff's deputy from Carter County, sat trembling in the federal interview room. After 40 years of silence, the burden had become too heavy to bear. In 1983, he had personally destroyed boxes of evidence related to the Blackwood case, birth records, complaint files, and photographs that might have exposed the truth decades earlier. "Judge Raymond Holcomb ordered me to burn it all," James explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Said it was causing unnecessary distress in the community. What James didn't know then, but investigators would soon discover, was that Judge Holcomb's maternal grandmother was born a Blackwood, making him a third cousin to Thomas Blackwood himself. This revelation cracked open the dam of silence. Within weeks, 3 former county clerks, a retired postmaster, and 2 elderly church deacons came forward with similar stories of evidence tampering, misdirected mail, and deliberately ignored reports. The pattern was unmistakable. A network of Blackwood relatives and sympathizers had infiltrated positions of authority across 5 states, creating a protective shield around the family's activities. Margaret Donovan, the social worker who had adopted children from the region in the 1980s, provided crucial testimony. After noticing unusual genetic markers in several children under her care, she had launched her own investigation. Margaret had meticulously documented physical similarities, behavioral patterns, and health conditions that created a genetic fingerprint linking dozens of abandoned children to the Blackwood bloodline. The children would wake screaming from the same nightmare, Margaret testified. They described identical rituals and punishments, despite having punishments. Some had distinctive birthmarks in the same locations. It couldn't be coincidence. Her unofficial case files included photographs, medical records, and hand-drawn family trees that connected seemingly unrelated families across Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Carolinas. What had appeared to be isolated incidents of child abandonment now revealed themselves as a systematic dispersal of unwanted Blackwood offspring. Most damning were the testimonies from 3 elderly nurses who had worked at regional hospitals between 1950 and 1970. They described young women arriving in advanced labor, giving false names, and disappearing after delivery, always accompanied by older men who handled all interactions with hospital staff. "We knew something wasn't right," said Ruth Miller, a former delivery nurse. "But when we reported our concerns, the complaints vanished." One nurse who pushed too hard was transferred. Another lost her license on trumped-up charges. As the investigation expanded, a disturbing reality emerged. The Blackwood case wasn't just about one family's isolated horror. It was about an entire system that had been corrupted to protect the unthinkable, a conspiracy of silence that spanned generations. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The search team's flashlights cut through decades of darkness as they descended into the concealed basement. What they found defied all expectations. Martha Blackwood, 78 years old and barely recognizable from the few photographs they had, was huddled in the corner of a hidden room. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, had not seen proper daylight since the 1970s. "She was like a ghost," recalled Agent Diane Miller, who led the recovery team. "Martha didn't speak for the first 3 days after we found her. When Martha Blackwood finally began to talk, her words came in disjointed fragments, piecing together a horrifying narrative of captivity. Thomas had moved the family repeatedly whenever suspicions arose, always maintaining his iron grip through isolation and fear. According to Martha, her husband had convinced the children that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, a lie that kept them imprisoned more effectively than any lock or chain. He would read from his own version of Scripture, Martha whispered during one interview. The girls weren't allowed to question, not even once. The matriarch revealed how Elizabeth had attempted escape 3 times. The first attempt came after meeting George Hartford, when hope briefly flickered in the young woman's heart. Thomas discovered their correspondence and punished Elizabeth severely, keeping her isolated for months afterward. Her second attempt, 2 years later, nearly succeeded. She made it to a neighboring town before Thomas's associates found and returned her. "He had people everywhere," Martha explained. "Men from other families who believed in his teachings. They watched bus stations, train depots. There was nowhere to run." Martha's reunion with Elizabeth, now an elderly woman herself, became the emotional centerpiece of the investigation. The sisters, having survived Thomas's reign of terror, embraced for the first time in over 60 years. Witnesses described how the 2 women seemed to communicate without words, bound by shared trauma that transcended time. Through Martha's testimony, investigators finally understood the psychological methods Thomas employed. He had created a complex system of rewards and punishments, pitting siblings against each other while simultaneously fostering dependence. The children were taught that their suffering was divinely ordained, a twisted theology that Martha had eventually come to question, though never openly. "He made us believe we were special," she said, "that our pain was purifying us for some greater purpose." The medical team documented Martha's physical condition, evidence of multiple fractures, malnutrition, and untreated illnesses. But it was the psychological damage that proved most profound. Even decades after Thomas's death, Martha still lowered her eyes when speaking of him, her voice dropping to a whisper as though he might somehow hear her betrayal. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. A shocking discovery occurred when Martha Blackwood, the long-missing matriarch of the Blackwood family, was found alive in a concealed basement room of one of the abandoned properties. The 78-year-old woman was discovered by investigators after they noticed unusual temperature variations in the floorboards of what appeared to be a storage closet. Behind a false wall, they found Martha living in near-medieval conditions, surrounded by religious texts and crude drawings. Severely traumatized and initially unable to speak coherently, Martha Blackwood gradually began providing fragmented accounts of the family's flight across state lines, the regime of terror implemented by her husband, and Elizabeth's failed attempts to escape the family's grip. Her testimony painted Thomas Blackwood not merely as a strict patriarch, but as a calculating manipulator who used religious doctrine to justify unspeakable acts against his own children. "He believed he was creating a pure bloodline," Martha whispered during one recorded interview. "The outside world was corrupt," he said. "Only through us could salvation continue." The investigators arranged a brief, emotional reunion between Martha and Elizabeth at a secure medical facility. Though Elizabeth was now elderly herself, the moment she saw her mother, witnesses described how decades of trauma seemed to melt away as the two women embraced, weeping silently. Their reunion, though lasting less than an hour due to Martha's fragile health, became a pivotal moment in the investigation. Through Martha's fractured memories, the team gained critical insight into the methods Thomas used to maintain control over his growing family. She described elaborate punishment rituals, forced isolation, and a system of surveillance where children were trained to report on one another's transgressions. The psychological scars left on every member of the family became evident as Martha recounted how Thomas would pit siblings against each other, creating an atmosphere of constant fear and distrust. Elizabeth was the strong one, Martha revealed, her voice barely audible. She kept detailed records, even after they caught her trying to run away with 3 of the younger children. Thomas locked her in the root cellar for months, but she never stopped writing. Martha's testimony provided the missing link between the original Blackwood compound and the satellite communities that formed later. She confirmed that Thomas had established connections with like-minded individuals in neighboring states, creating a network that would eventually evolve into the modern cult discovered in Idaho. As investigators pieced together Martha's account with existing evidence, the true horror of the Blackwood legacy began to emerge, a multi-generational nightmare that had survived through secrecy, intimidation, and the complicity of those who chose to look away. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. George Hartford's life became defined by his search for Elizabeth Blackwood. After her sudden disappearance in 1915, the Bible salesman abandoned his traveling trade and dedicated himself to uncovering what had happened to her and her sisters. His modest notebook, initially filled with sales records, transformed into a meticulous chronicle of his investigation. "I promised I would help them," George wrote in 1917, "and I will not rest until I know they are safe." His detailed notes documented conversations with reluctant locals, sketches of the abandoned Blackwood property, and countless dead ends that only strengthened his resolve. For decades, the salesman traveled across state lines, following whispers and rumors. He spent his savings on private investigators who often took his money but produced few results. In 1932, he believed he had found a lead in Kentucky, describing in his journal how he glimpsed a woman with Elizabeth's unmistakable gait at a rural market, but she vanished before he could approach. The recordings George left behind, first on wax cylinders, later on magnetic tape, reveal a man consumed by his mission. His voice, initially strong and determined, grows more weathered with each passing year, yet never loses its underlying hope. "I know she's alive," he stated in a 1954 recording. "I can feel it in my bones." What makes these archives particularly valuable to modern investigators is George's methodical approach. He interviewed former neighbors, tracked property records, and mapped possible escape routes from each suspected Blackwood location. His notes contain details that official records deliberately omitted. Names of officials who blocked inquiries, descriptions of vehicles seen near Blackwood properties, and patterns of movement that suggested an organized network rather than a single family in hiding. George Hartford never found Elizabeth. He died in 1968, his apartment walls covered with maps marked with possible Blackwood locations. The landlord, finding no next of kin, nearly discarded his belongings before a local historian recognized their potential significance. These materials remained in storage until the case reopened in 1946, when investigators discovered the connection between Hartford's meticulous records and the mysterious map found in the safety deposit box. His decades of work provided context that would have otherwise been lost to time. "Without George's persistence, we would have missed crucial links," noted one FBI agent in 2005. He kept the case alive when everyone else wanted to forget. The salesman's unwavering dedication to Elizabeth and her sisters, people he barely knew but couldn't abandon, stands as a powerful counterpoint to the institutional neglect that allowed the Blackwoods to operate in shadows for so long. His simple act of believing Elizabeth's letters when authorities dismissed them ultimately helped bring justice decades after his death. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In 1972, investigative journalist Diane Reynolds stumbled upon a series of local rumors about the Blackwood family while researching rural American cults. What began as a peripheral interest quickly consumed her professional life. She meticulously documented interviews with elderly residents who remembered whispers about the family's sudden disappearance decades earlier. "They vanished like ghosts," one elderly man told her, his hands trembling as he spoke. "And those who asked too many questions seemed to find trouble." Diane's motel room was broken into 3 weeks into her investigation. Her recording equipment and notebooks vanished, but the journalist had wisely kept duplicates hidden in her vehicle. Undeterred, she continued gathering testimonies, photographing the overgrown Blackwood property, and tracing property records across state lines. 2 days before she was scheduled to meet with a network executive about producing a documentary, Diane disappeared. Her automobile was found abandoned at a gas station 20 miles from her motel. The local authorities conducted a perfunctory investigation, concluding she had likely moved on to another story. Her family insisted this was impossible. Diane would never abandon her most promising lead. The case went cold until 1989, when a retired postal worker discovered a waterproof container buried beneath his garden shed. Inside were Diane's missing notes, meticulously organized and sealed against the elements. The package included a hastily written letter. "If you're reading this, I've been silenced. The Blackwoods are still watching. What I've found goes deeper than anyone suspects. Her documentation revealed a network of Blackwood descendants and sympathizers positioned throughout local government, law enforcement, and business communities across 4 states. She had mapped connections between seemingly unrelated families, all tracing back to Thomas Blackwood's original Colony of Purity doctrine. Most chillingly, Diane had identified 3 active Blackwood-affiliated communities operating under different names, complete with photographs taken from a distance showing compound-like properties with armed guards. Federal investigators later confirmed that Diane had come dangerously close to exposing the full extent of the Blackwood network. Her meticulous research provided crucial links that would have otherwise taken years to establish. The authorities now believe her disappearance was no coincidence, but rather a deliberate silencing orchestrated by Blackwood descendants who had infiltrated positions of power, specifically to protect their secret. Diane's notes contained one final haunting detail: a list of 7 other journalists and investigators who had previously attempted to research the Blackwood family. All had either abandoned their projects after reported threats or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Her work posthumously became the foundation for the case that would eventually bring down the Blackwood legacy. The investigation's scope widened dramatically when FBI analysts discovered a disturbing pattern. The Blackwood doctrine hadn't died with Thomas Blackwood. It had evolved and spread like a virus across generations. Between 2005 and 2021, investigators identified at least 3 fringe religious communities in rural Missouri and the remote mountains of Idaho, with direct connections to Blackwood descendants. Special Agent Marissa Collins, who had dedicated 15 years to tracking cult activities, noticed the similarities immediately. These groups maintained the same isolation tactics, the same obsession with bloodlines, and the same methods of controlling information, she explained in her testimony. But they'd become more sophisticated, using modern technology to hide in plain sight while maintaining their medieval practices. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the journalist who had disappeared in 1972. Her notes, finally recovered from a storage unit auctioned off in 2007, contained a detailed family tree that helped investigators trace the bloodlines forward. The missing pieces fell into place when DNA evidence from the original Blackwood estate matched samples collected during an unrelated drug investigation in Idaho. The leader of the Idaho community, a charismatic man known to his followers as Father Jacob, was identified through genetic testing as Jacob Blackwood, Thomas's great-grandson. His compound, nestled in the mountains and protected by armed guards, housed over 70 people living under conditions that mirrored those Elizabeth had described in her diaries decades earlier. Federal agents placed the compound under surveillance for 6 months. What they observed chilled even the most seasoned investigators. Children separated from mothers at birth, women confined to specific areas, and punishment rituals carried out under the cover of darkness. Jacob had modernized his great-grandfather's methods while maintaining the core ideology of blood purity that had defined the original cult. He learned from Thomas's mistakes, Agent Collins noted. Where Thomas kept everything within a single family unit, Jacob created a network. Where Thomas relied on physical isolation, Jacob used psychological techniques and technology to maintain control. The surveillance revealed something else. Jacob maintained communication with similar communities across 3 states. The Blackwood doctrine had metastasized, adapting to survive in the modern world while preserving its most destructive elements. Most disturbing was the discovery of coded messages exchanged between these communities, using the same cipher system found in Elizabeth's diaries. The evil that had begun in 1903 with Thomas Blackwood had found new vessels, new victims, and new methods of perpetuation, proving that the most dangerous aspect of the Blackwood legacy wasn't the man himself, but the ideology he had created and the generations who continued to believe in it. Before we begin, Make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The investigation uncovered a disturbing evolution of the Blackwood Doctrine. Between 2005 and 2021, investigators traced fringe groups in Missouri and Idaho back to direct Blackwood descendants who had quietly continued propagating the cult's teachings under new names and guises. What had begun as one man's twisted ideology had metastasized across generations, adapting to modern scrutiny while preserving its core beliefs. The pattern was unmistakable, explained the lead FBI investigator. Isolated compounds, strict hierarchies, and the same rhetoric about blood purity that Thomas Blackwood preached over a century ago. The breakthrough came when authorities identified the leader of a secluded community in rural Idaho as James Whitley, a direct descendant of Thomas Blackwood through one of his sons. DNA evidence confirmed what the behavioral patterns had suggested. The bloodline had continued, and with it, the doctrine. Under surveillance for 6 months, federal agents observed disturbing parallels to the original cult. Children kept from school, women in subservient roles, and an elaborate system of punishment for those who questioned authority. Technology had changed, but the methods remained eerily similar. Where Thomas once used physical isolation, James employed digital isolation, allowing only controlled internet access and monitoring all communications. The community's 27 members lived on a 40-acre compound surrounded by dense forest, their existence virtually unknown to neighboring towns. They called themselves the Pure Path, said a former member who had escaped 3 years earlier. But it was just the Blackwood Doctrine repackaged for a new generation. Documents recovered from the compound revealed meticulous record-keeping, including family trees that proudly traced lineage back to Thomas Blackwood. Most chilling were the coded journals that echoed Elizabeth's writings from decades earlier, accounts of suffering written in the same cryptic language she had developed to document her experiences. The social worker who had first noticed genetic markers in the 80s was vindicated by these findings. Her unofficial investigation had been dismissed for years, but now served as a foundation for the federal case. "I knew what I was seeing wasn't coincidence," she testified. The physical traits, the behavioral patterns, they were too consistent across unrelated adoptions. As evidence mounted, authorities realized they were not dealing with isolated incidents, but with a coordinated network. The modern community in Idaho represented just one branch of a larger system that had operated in the shadows for over a century, protected by the same institutional complicity that had shielded Thomas Blackwood. "What we're seeing is the culmination of generational trauma and indoctrination," explained a psychologist consulting on the case. "These beliefs didn't disappear. They evolved and found new hosts." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Elizabeth Blackwood's diaries became the most powerful testament to the horrors endured by the Blackwood family. Published in 2022, these intimate accounts, written in Elizabeth's careful coded script, sold millions of copies worldwide. Her words, preserved through decades of suffering, resonated with readers who found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about community complicity and the dangers of looking away. "I write these words knowing they may never be read," one entry began, "but I must believe that someday someone will hear our story." The diaries detailed not only the physical and psychological abuse, but also small moments of resistance and hope that sustained Elizabeth through her darkest days. Historians and psychologists analyzed the texts, finding them invaluable for understanding how isolation enables abuse. Universities incorporated the diaries into curriculum across disciplines, from psychology to law enforcement training. The cultural impact was undeniable, a nationwide reckoning with the shadows that exist in seemingly ordinary communities. Martha Blackwood, in her final interview before passing away in 2023, spoke of her daughter's courage. "Elizabeth saved us all, even though she couldn't save herself, the elderly woman whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched a photograph of her youngest daughter. She never stopped fighting, even when I had given up. The social worker who had first connected adopted children to the Blackwood lineage established a foundation dedicated to supporting survivors of similar isolated communities. Elizabeth's words gave voice to those who still cannot speak, she explained at the foundation's launch. There are others out there, still trapped in silence. Despite the federal raids and widespread exposure, authorities remained concerned. Investigations revealed that splinter groups had already formed before the Idaho compound was discovered. These smaller cells, each practicing variations of Thomas Blackwood's doctrine, had scattered across rural America. We've dismantled the largest operation, but the ideology has spread like a virus, admitted the lead federal investigator. These beliefs don't die easily. They adapt and find new hosts. The documentary's final scenes showed the former Blackwood property in Appalachia, now overgrown and eerily peaceful. The hidden cemetery had become a memorial site, with simple markers replacing the cryptic symbols. Visitors left flowers for the unnamed victims, their identities lost to time and silence. As the camera panned across the American landscape, from isolated farmhouses to small towns with their secrets, the narrator's voice delivered a final warning. The Blackwood horror story has ended, but others may be unfolding behind closed doors. Evil thrives when good people choose not to see, not to hear, not to speak. It takes just one voice, like Elizabeth's, to break decades of silence. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from.